In the 1950s, a strange phrase began appearing in internal files: infant bone samples required for fallout study. It was not metaphorical language, but official wording. This was not a rumor or later speculation. The line appears in declassified documents from the Cold War era, preserved in government archives. At the height of nuclear weapons testing, scientists were trying to measure how radioactive fallout was affecting the human body. One of their biggest concerns was strontium-90, a byproduct of atomic explosions known to accumulate in bones, especially in growing children. To understand the scale of exposure, research programs were organized across multiple countries to collect and analyze bone tissue samples. One of these initiatives operated under the name Project Sunshine, a scientific effort shaped by the fears and uncertainties of the atomic age. The air in the sterile maternity ward of the 1950s was thick with the scent of industrial floor wax and strong antiseptic. But beneath the clinical order, a predatory silence was growing. It was the summer of 1957 in Adelaide, and the world was unknowingly breathing the invisible dust of the atomic age. Jean Pritchard sat on the edge of her hospital bed, clutching a thin cotton blanket that felt far too light in her trembling hands. Her newborn daughter had entered the world in a silence that no doctor could break, and the young mother was trapped in a state of hollow grief that made the walls feel cold. She did not notice the heavy footsteps of Dr. Robert Mottram as he approached her door with a clipboard tucked tightly under his arm. Mottram was a man who believed that the survival of the Western world justified the absolute silence of the morgue, and he had a very specific task to complete that day. Dr. Robert Mottram entered the room with a voice that was practiced in its softness, offering words of sympathy that never quite reached his eyes. He spoke to Jean about the needs of national science and the importance of understanding new diseases for the protection of future generations of children. He presented a series of documents that were filled with complex medical jargon and references to public health statutes, but he carefully avoided the word radiation. He never mentioned that a secret furnace was already being heated in a laboratory in Chicago, waiting for a very specific kind of fuel. While Jean Pritchard signed the papers with a hand that would not stop shaking, her child was being moved to a basement room that smelled of cold iron and damp concrete. There, under the flickering light of a single bulb, the medical staff prepared to harvest the most precious resource of the nuclear era. They were no longer treating a human being with a name and a family, but were instead processing a biological sensor for the United States Atomic Energy Commission. The sound of the surgical instruments clinking against the steel trays was the only music playing in that hidden corner of the hospital. Dr. Robert Mottram worked with a steady and detached precision, removing the samples required by the architects of Project Sunshine. The empty spaces left behind were filled with wads of surgical cotton to ensure the shroud maintained the illusion of a full weight when it was returned to the mother. In a high-security office in Washington, District of Columbia, Dr. Willard Libby paced the floor while reading the latest cables from the Southern Hemisphere. He was a man of immense intellect who viewed the global population as a vast laboratory, and he was growing impatient with the slow pace of the harvest. Libby had famously written to his colleagues that the only way to win the secret war was to find doctors who were willing to snatch bodies from the morgue without question. To him, the ethics of the cemetery were irrelevant when compared to the physics of a hydrogen bomb exploding in the Pacific Ocean. At Columbia University, Dr. J. Lawrence Culp received the lead-lined canisters with a nod of professional satisfaction that masked the horror of the contents. He opened the heavy lids to reveal the remains of specimens gathered from 3 different continents, all destined for the same chemical destruction. The air in the laboratory of Dr. Culp was heavy with the scent of nitric acid and the fine white dust of pulverized human history. Every time a new shipment arrived, the staff moved with a terrifying efficiency as they prepared to dissolve the bones to extract the signature of strontium-90. A young nurse named Mary Henderson stood by the hospital gates, watching as a group of men in plain clothes loaded unmarked wooden crates onto a waiting truck. She had been instructed to keep the records of these cases in a separate, locked cabinet, and to never discuss the details with the grieving parents. The weight of the secret felt like a physical burden in her chest as she watched the truck disappear into the morning fog of 1957. She knew that the caskets being buried in the local cemetery were missing the very parts that the government claimed were necessary for the survival of the state. The parents were given sealed boxes and told that for reasons of public safety, they must never be opened before the burial took place. Jean Pritchard stood at a small grave in the rain, never suspecting that the daughter she was mourning had already been reduced to a series of data points on a scientist's desk. The tactile reality of Project Sunshine was a world of hidden ledgers and silent corridors where the truth was traded for a strategic advantage. Every time a Geiger counter clicked in a laboratory in Maryland, it was echoing the theft of a life that had only just begun before it was claimed by the atom. The visual landscape of the 1950s was being carefully rewritten in the shadows of the Cold War to hide the cost of progress. While the public watched cheerful films about the wonders of nuclear energy, the bone collectors were building a map of the world's radioactive decay using stolen calcium. Dr. Robert Mottram filed his final report for the day and walked out into the cool evening air, feeling the satisfaction of a soldier who had done his duty. The scent of the morgue seemed to cling to his coat, a lingering reminder of the price that the innocent were forced to pay for the secrets of power. The lead-lined boxes continued to arrive at the processing centers in the American Midwest, each one a testament to a global network of betrayal and greed. The names of the victims were replaced by alphanumeric codes like Specimen 42 or Sample 87 to ensure that the researchers felt no empathy. The humanity of the era was being dissolved in the same acid baths used to test the bones of the young for the presence of radioactive fallout. Willard Libby's voice continued to echo through the secret meetings of the commission, reminding everyone that the data was the only currency that truly mattered. He believed that the desecration of the grave was a small price to pay for the ability to predict the effects of a nuclear winter on the food supply. The shadow of the bone collector had become the official policy of the government, hidden behind a name that suggested warmth and light instead of ash. In the quiet suburbs, the milk was delivered every morning to the doorsteps of families who believed they were living in the safest time in history. They did not know that the same government protecting them was also monitoring the poison in their children's bones through a global system of theft. The archive in Maryland grew larger with every passing month, filled with the records of 1,000 silent crimes committed in the name of science. The scent of the paper was the scent of a buried truth that would take decades to emerge from the darkness of the classified folders and the locked safes. The bone collectors were the ghosts of the 1950s, moving through the lives of the vulnerable with the precision of a predator. The story of Jean Pritchard and the cold hands of Dr. Robert Mottram is just the first page in a book of secrets that the world was never intended to read or understand. The heavy silence of the National Archives is finally being broken by the sound of these words, as the names of the victims are brought back into the light. The experiment was a success in the eyes of the generals, but the soul of the medical profession was the ultimate casualty of Project Sunshine. By 1954, the logistics of Project Sunshine had evolved from a desperate scientific inquiry into a seamless international operation of industrial theft. Every Tuesday morning, unmarked delivery vans with darkened windows backed into the high-security loading docks of the University of Chicago. Inside these vehicles were wooden crates constructed from heavy oak, containing lead canisters that hummed with a silent and radioactive history. These containers were unnaturally heavy for their size, and the men who handled them wore thick leather gloves to avoid the chill of the metal. Dr. Willard Libby, the cold architect of this global harvest, sat in his wood-paneled office at the Atomic Energy Commission in Washington. He was a man possessed by a single and terrifying number: 1,000. He believed that only 1,000 young skeletons could save the world. He needed these specimens to create a statistically perfect map of how strontium-90 was migrating from the Pacific bomb clouds into the very marrow of humanity. To Libby, the children of the world were no longer individuals, but biological sensors recording the progress of the Cold War. In the sterile and windowless basements of the University of Chicago, the furnaces burned at a constant and punishing temperature of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The bones of the young were not studied for their structure or their beauty, but were instead treated as raw ore to be refined. The sound of the mechanical grinders was a constant low roar that filled the hallways of the science building, drowning out any whispers of conscience or doubt. Each skeleton was reduced to a fine and powdery gray substance known in the secret reports as high-purity bone ash. The air in these underground laboratories was a toxic and choking cocktail of concentrated nitric acid and the fine dust of pulverized human history. Scientists like Dr. J. Lawrence Culp wore thick rubber aprons and heavy respirators, moving through the chemical haze like ghosts in a white void. They handled the remains of children shipped from London and Tokyo with the same cold and clinical detachment as a warehouse clerk counting mundane inventory. To them, a human life was merely the ratio of radioactive isotopes scrawled in black ink on a gray government ledger. In a small and quiet suburb of Chicago, a young woman named Ann Miller stood in a hospital hallway, clutching her husband's hand in a grip of pure agony. She had just been told that her stillborn son required a state-mandated autopsy for reasons of urgent public safety and national health. She stood there, smelling the faint scent of rain on her wool coat, completely unaware that Dr. Libby's secret network had already marked her child. In the classified files, her son was no longer a lost dream, but was instead recorded as specimen number 42, a variable in a nuclear equation. The tactile reality of this systematic theft was found in the strange and empty weight of the small white caskets provided to the mourning families. To maintain the cruel illusion of a whole body, the bone collectors would often place heavy glass bottles or rolls of surgical gauze inside the burial shrouds. The parents stood at the gravesides, burying hollow symbols of their grief, while the state kept the biological reality in a glass jar in a locked basement. Project Sunshine was fueled by the terrifying and absolute logic of the Cold War, where the survival of the many justified the desecration of the few. Every time a new hydrogen bomb detonated in the turquoise waters of the Pacific, the demand for fresh and untainted bone samples increased exponentially. The collectors became more aggressive and more creative in their methods, targeting the orphanages and hospitals in the poorest and most forgotten districts. The visual landscape of this operation was one of high-contrast shadows and flickering fluorescent lights that made the skin of the scientists look gray. In the secret files, the humanity of the victims was systematically replaced by complex chemical symbols and precise radiation counts that felt like a new language. Dr. Willard Libby famously told his colleagues in a closed-door meeting that if they could find a doctor who could snatch a body, they would win the war. This was not a poetic metaphor, but a direct operational order that turned the medical profession into a covert arm of the United States military. The sacred oath to do no harm was quietly buried under the growing piles of bone ash that accumulated in the laboratories of the Atomic Energy Commission. The scent of the 1950s was the smell of technological progress, mixed with the hidden rot of a government that had lost its way. While families gathered around their new television sets to watch the wonders of the future, the bone collectors were filling lead boxes with the remnants of the past. The project was a masterpiece of administrative darkness, where the paper trail was designed to lead to a dead end in a Maryland archive. As the sun set over the jagged Chicago skyline, the smoke from the secret incinerators carried the microscopic remains of the global harvest back into the sky. It was a cycle of radioactive irony that the very bones being tested for fallout were themselves becoming part of the atmosphere they were meant to measure. The architects of silence had created a self-sustaining system that fed on the smallest members of society to protect the largest interests of the state. The experiment was no longer just a temporary test, but had become a permanent and terrifying feature of the global nuclear landscape. The bone collectors are still moving through the dark corridors of our history, leaving a trail of gray ash that refuses to settle on the ground. The heavy metal drawers of the National Archive groan with a sound like a human cry as they are pulled out to reveal more names and more betrayals. You can still feel the cold and stagnant air of the 1950s morgue hitting your skin as you read the redacted lines of the Sunshine Files. The metallic tang of the atom remains on the tongue of every document found in the basement of the Maryland facility where the truth was kept. The scientists believed that their pristine white lab coats were shields against any form of moral or legal judgment from the outside world. But the ink on their reports tells a different story of a generation that traded its humanity for the ability to measure the exact rate of its own destruction. The weight of 1,000 stolen lives is now being calculated in the dark by those who have finally found the keys to the lead-lined canisters. Each grain of ash holds the memory of a name that was erased, and a family that was lied to in the name of a peace that felt like a war. The second chapter of this declassified nightmare ends with the realization that the harvest was not just about the bones, but about the soul of a nation. The furnaces are still cooling, and the smoke is still rising, but the file on Project Sunshine is only beginning to reveal its most horrific secrets. Welcome back to the global morgue, where the lights never go out, and the data is never enough to satisfy the hunger of the atomic scientists. As we move deeper into the archive, the individual stories of the mothers and the collectors will collide in a way that no one could have predicted. The truth is a heavy burden, and the file is only getting thicker as we uncover the places and the faces that the government tried to erase from time. The bone collectors are waiting in the shadows of the past, and their story is far from over in this immersive journey through the radioactive truth. The sound of a telephone ringing in the dead of night during the winter of 1955 was never a harbinger of good news, but for the doctors on the secret payroll of the Atomic Energy Commission, it was a cold summons to the morgue. This was the year the invisible harvest of Project Sunshine became a frantic race against the clock. Willard Libby sat in his office, surrounded by maps of the Pacific, where the fallout from the Castle Bravo test was still circling the globe like a radioactive ghost. He watched the charts of strontium-90 levels rising in the soil of the American Midwest, and he knew the data in his ledgers was still dangerously incomplete. The Pacific winds had carried the ash of the atom into the high atmosphere, where it cooled and fell as a silent, toxic rain over the dairy pastures of Wisconsin and the wheat fields of Kansas. The cows ate the grass, and the children drank the milk, unknowingly inviting the predator into their growing skeletons. To track this invasion, Libby needed more than just random samples. He needed a streamlined pipeline of human remains that functioned with the efficiency of a factory line. He began to recruit what he called procurement officers, men in white coats who were willing to trade their medical ethics for a sense of national duty. The visual texture of this recruitment was one of dim mahogany offices and the heavy smell of expensive cigar smoke, where the architects of the project met with hospital administrators. They spoke in hushed tones about the greater good and the necessity of sacrifice in the face of a potential Soviet nuclear strike. In the laboratories of Columbia University, Dr. J. Lawrence Culp was perfecting the art of biological destruction. He had designed a series of acid baths that could dissolve a human femur in less than 4 hours, leaving behind only the pure mineral essence that held the secrets of the radioactive sky. The sound of the laboratory was the rhythmic bubbling of the nitric acid and the clinking of heavy glass carboys as the scientists moved with a terrifying and practiced grace. They were no longer bothered by the origin of the specimens they handled, as the lead canisters had become as mundane as office supplies. Each shipment that arrived from the procurement officers was accompanied by a telegram containing a single code word that indicated the age and condition of the variable. The word sunshine was used to describe the most prized samples, those belonging to infants who had lived less than 30 days in the atomic world. The tactile reality of these shipments was found in the coldness of the lead, which seemed to absorb the very heat from the room. The technicians who opened the boxes wore thick rubberized aprons and face shields to protect themselves not from the dead, but from the invisible energy that pulsed within the bone ash. In a large city hospital in London, a nurse named Elizabeth Vance noticed a pattern of missing records in the pediatric ward. But when she raised the issue, she was met with a wall of administrative silence. She was told that the state had assumed jurisdiction over certain cases for reasons of national health and security. The scent of the hospital in 1955 was a mixture of floor wax and the metallic tang of the new diagnostic machines that were appearing in every wing. Elizabeth watched as the unmarked vans arrived at the service entrance in the pre-dawn hours, taking away the small white bundles that never reached the cemetery. The visual contrast between the bright posters of the National Health Service and the dark reality of the bone theft was a hallmark of the era. While the public was told that the government was their protector, the reality was that the state had become a scavenger, feeding on the remains of its own most vulnerable citizens. Willard Libby famously stated that if they could find a doctor who could snatch a body, they would have the data to win the Cold War. This cold philosophy trickled down through the ranks of the medical establishment, creating a culture where the desecration of the grave was viewed as a scientific necessity. In the secret ledgers, the names of the children were replaced by a complex system of letters and numbers that erased any trace of their humanity. A child who had been loved and mourned was now simply Specimen 704, a data point on a graph showing the steady accumulation of strontium-90 in the marrow. The atmosphere of the 1950s was one of collective anxiety, where the fear of the mushroom cloud justified almost any transgression of human rights. The bone collectors moved through this fear like shadows in a storm, their scalpels and lead boxes, the tools of a war that had no front lines and no clear enemies. Imagine the cold surface of the laboratory bench, where a scientist measures the weight of a life in grams of gray powder. The visual detail of the precision scales and the white porcelain crucibles is a reminder of how easily the sacred can be reduced to the statistical in the name of a political ideology. By 1956, the network of bone collectors had expanded to include funeral directors, who were paid secret stipends to provide samples from the deceased without the knowledge of the families. The scent of the funeral parlor became the scent of a new and profitable market in the commerce of human calcium. As the sun set over the sprawling campus of the University of Chicago, the smoke from the secret incinerators blended with the evening mist, carrying the remains of the global harvest back into the lungs of the city. It was a cycle of betrayal that was as constant and invisible as the radiation they were trying to measure. The architects of silence believed they were building a shield for the nation, but they were actually building a monument to their own moral decay. Every page of the Sunshine Files is a testament to a world where the individual was secondary to the requirements of the nuclear state, and the truth was a casualty of war. The third chapter of The Bone Collectors reveals the expansion of the shadow network into the very heart of the community, where the hospital and the funeral home became annexes of the laboratory. The harvest was now a global industry, and the collectors were becoming bolder as the demand for young bone ash reached its peak. The heavy metal drawers of the Maryland archive are now spilling over with the records of these secret transactions, revealing the names of the doctors who became the agents of the atom. The light in the room is harsh and unforgiving as it illuminates the signatures of the men who sold the bones of the innocent for a secret. You can still feel the vibration of the grinders and the heat of the furnaces as you read the declassified reports from the winter of 1955. The metallic tang of the atom is on every page, a lingering reminder of the price that was paid for the data that now sits in a locked safe in a government basement. The bone collectors believed they were the guardians of the future, but they were actually the ghosts of a past that refuses to stay buried. Their story is a journey into the heart of a clinical darkness, where the government decided that your children were no longer yours, but were instead the property of the nuclear age. The third chapter ends in the silence of a London morgue, where the lights are flickering and the lead canisters are being loaded onto a waiting plane. The experiment was reaching its most intense phase, and the bone collectors were about to discover the true extent of the radioactive curse that they had been tracking so carefully. Welcome to the center of the radioactive web, where the data is written in ash, and the laboratory is the entire world. As we move into the next chapter, the consequences of the theft will begin to manifest in the lives of the survivors, and the secret of Project Sunshine will finally start to crack under the weight of its own horror. The lead canisters arriving at the Maryland secret facility in 1956 were not just cold to the touch. They carried the weight of 1,000 silent betrayals. Willard Libby, the architect of Project Sunshine, sat in his office, staring at the rising graphs of strontium-90 accumulation across the globe. He was a man possessed by a single and terrifying number: 1,000. He believed that only 1,000 young skeletons could save the world from total radioactive ignorance. To Libby, the children of the world were no longer individuals, but biological sensors recording the progress of the Cold War. In Australia, Dr. Robert Mottram was perfecting his method of procurement with a chilling detachment. He had become the most efficient agent in the Southern Hemisphere, providing a steady stream of what the Atomic Energy Commission called young bone ash to the furnaces of the American labs. Jean Pritchard, the mother from Adelaide, still visited the small grave every Sunday afternoon, unaware that the coffin she wept over was filled with surgical gauze and heavy glass bottles. The government had decided that her daughter's legs were more valuable in a lab than resting in the quiet earth. At Columbia University, Dr. J. Lawrence Culp was overseeing the final reduction of these specimens into dust. The sound of the bone grinders was a constant mechanical scream that echoed through the ventilation shafts, carrying the dust of stolen lives into the gray New York sky above. The air in the laboratory of Dr. Culp was heavy with the scent of concentrated nitric acid and the fine white powder of pulverized human history. Every time a new shipment arrived, the staff moved with a terrifying efficiency as they prepared to dissolve the bones to extract the signature of the atom. A young nurse named Mary Henderson, who had once assisted Robert Mottram, now suffered from nightmares of empty cradles and unmarked crates. She had been instructed to keep the records of these cases in a separate, locked cabinet, and to never discuss the details with the grieving parents of the city. The weight of the secret felt like a physical burden in her chest as she watched the unmarked transport planes cross the Pacific at night. She knew that the caskets being buried in the local cemetery were missing the very parts that the government claimed were necessary for the survival of the state. The visual landscape of 1956 was a world of high-contrast noir, where the bright lights of the laboratory reflected off the stainless steel trays. Each sample was a piece of a global map, showing that the atom had already claimed the marrow of the next generation, born in the nuclear age. The tactile reality of the project was the coldness of the lead and the gritty texture of the gray powder that remained after the furnaces were cooled. Scientists handled the remains with thick rubber gloves, fearing the radiation, but ignoring the moral rot that was eating their own professional souls. Shockingly, the documents reveal that Willard Libby once told his team that if they could find a doctor who could snatch a body, they would have the data to win the war. This was not a suggestion of research. It was a direct order for organized international body snatching, sanctioned at the highest levels. The logistics of the theft were handled with the same precision as a military invasion of a foreign land. Agents traveled to the corners of the earth, seeking out hospitals where the mourning process was most chaotic and the oversight was most lax, to ensure the harvest was never interrupted by the law. Imagine the silence of a grieving mother, as she is told her child must remain in the hospital for further observation, only to have that child whisked away. The tactile reality of this betrayal is found in the scratches on the metal tables and the dim yellow light of the morgue where the collectors worked. In the secret reports filed under the seal of the Commission, these infants were referred to as variables, to be measured in units of radiation. Their names were erased and replaced by numbers in a ledger that was kept in a locked safe in a basement in Maryland, where the truth was buried very deep. By 1957, the network of bone collectors had expanded to include funeral directors who were paid secret stipends to provide samples. The scent of the funeral parlor became the scent of a new and profitable market in the commerce of human calcium, fueled by the fear of a Soviet strike. As the sun set over the sprawling campus of the University of Chicago, the smoke from the secret incinerators blended with the evening mist. It was a cycle of radioactive irony that the very bones being tested for fallout were themselves becoming part of the atmosphere they were meant to measure. The architects of silence believed they were building a shield for the nation, but they were actually building a monument to their own moral decay. Every page of the Sunshine Files is a testament to a world where the individual was secondary to the requirements of the nuclear state, and the truth was lost. The final twist of the year was the discovery that the radiation levels in the stolen bones were 10 times higher than originally predicted. The architects realized that the fallout was not just in the soil, it was in the food and the very air the children breathed every single day of their lives. The sound of the Geiger counter in the Maryland basement became a frantic staccato rhythm, echoing the panic of the scientific elite. It was the sound of a world that had been poisoned from the inside out by the very men who claimed to be its guardians in the face of total nuclear destruction. The heavy metal drawers of the archive are now open wide, revealing the signatures of men like Robert Mottram and J. Lawrence Culp. Their names are etched in the history of science, alongside the victims they stripped of their final dignity in the name of national security and the atomic dream. The scent of the 1950s remains trapped in these folders, a mixture of formaldehyde and the metallic tang of the atom. We are looking at the blueprint for a betrayal that turned the cradle into a laboratory and the grave into a source of raw materials for the masters of the bomb. The experiment was a success, but the humanity of the architects was the ultimate sacrifice in the pursuit of nuclear dominance. As we move closer to the final truth, the weight of the Sunshine Files becomes unbearable for those who still believe in the sanctity of the human body and the oath. The fourth chapter ends in the cold quiet of a transatlantic flight, where the cargo is silent, but the implications are deafening for the future. The experiment was expanding, and the bone collectors were finding new ways to hide their tracks as the world moved closer to the edge of the nuclear abyss. Welcome back to the global morgue, where the lights never go out and the data is never enough to satisfy the hunger of the Atomic Commission. As we move into the next chapter, the consequences of the theft will begin to manifest in the lives of the survivors, and the secrets will start to crack. The truth is a heavy burden, and the file is only getting thicker as we uncover the names and the places that the government tried to erase. The bone collectors are still out there in the shadows of the past, and their story is far from over in this immersive journey through the truth. As we turn the page, we see the first names of the doctors who turned their backs on the oath of healing to serve the god of the atom. The light in the laboratory flickers, as if the building itself is trying to blink away the sight of the stainless steel trays and the gray ash. The heavy metal doors of the archive groan as they are pushed open, revealing the true extent of a betrayal that has been hidden for over 70 years. You can feel the cold air from the past hitting your face, bringing with it the metallic tang of a world ready to sacrifice everything. The fourth chapter of The Bone Collectors is a journey into the heart of a sterile darkness, where the government decided your children were property. The experiment was only beginning, and the scale of the theft would soon reach proportions that defy any logic or sense of human decency in science. Each sample was carefully labeled and placed into lead-lined containers that felt unnaturally heavy for their size in the hands of the technicians. These boxes were then shipped across the ocean in the holds of unmarked planes, arriving at the destination, where the furnaces were always burning at steady heat. The sound of the incinerator was a constant, low roar that masked the gravity of what was being consumed within the brick walls. The bones were reduced to a fine, gray powder, which was then subjected to chemical analysis to reveal the secrets of the sky and the radioactive rain of the desert. The year 1994 was the moment the silence of the Cold War finally shattered under the weight of its own secrets. A massive release of documents revealed the true scope of Project Sunshine to a world that had long forgotten the fear of the mushroom cloud. The air in the hearing room felt heavy with the scent of old paper. Jean Pritchard sat in the gallery of the inquiry, her hands gripped together so tightly her knuckles were white as bone. She listened to the testimony of men in suits who spoke of specimens and variables with clinical indifference. She realized they were talking about her daughter's legs, which had been stolen nearly 40 years ago. The testimony revealed that Dr. Robert Mottram had received a secret commendation for his efficiency in procurement. He had provided over 100 samples from the Australian hospitals to the American labs. Each sample was a betrayal of the medical oath, wrapped in a sterile plastic bag and labeled with a cold code. The visual evidence was presented in the form of a grainy black and white film found in the basement of Fort Detrick. It showed the interior of the University of Chicago laboratory, where the furnaces were still glowing with a low heat. The sound of the film projector was a rhythmic clicking that matched the heartbeat. We see the porcelain crucibles filled with the fine gray dust that was once the living structure of a human life. This was the ultimate harvest of the atomic age. The scientists, like Willard Libby, didn't see the faces of the mourning families. They only saw the concentration of strontium-90 measured in units of debt. Shockingly, the files revealed that the government had claimed legal ownership over the stolen remains through a secret directive. Under this order, the bodies of those affected by nuclear fallout were considered state property for national security. This was the moment the human being was officially downgraded to a government asset. The tactile horror of the revelation was the realization that the burials were an elaborate state-manufactured lie. Thousands of families had stood over graves filled with bricks and surgical cotton to maintain the weight. They had wept for shadows, while the substance of their loved ones was being dissolved in acid. Dr. Willard Libby had won his Nobel Prize, but the cost was a permanent stain on the soul of global science. His maps of the world were drawn in the ash of the innocent. The scent of the archive in Maryland is the smell of a moral graveyard, where the headstones are made of redacted paper and ink. In the final documents, a new and terrifying follow-up project was mentioned, under the name Project Gabriel. It suggested that the bone collection was only the first phase of a larger plan. The goal was to track the radiation through the bloodlines of the survivors. The experiment was designed to span a century. Jean Pritchard walked out of the hearing into the bright sun of the modern era, but the world looked different to her. She realized that the atom was not just in the sky or the soil. It was in her memories and in the very DNA of her remaining children. The shadow of the collector was eternal. The visual landscape of the story ends in a dark basement where one lead canister remains unopened and forgotten. It sits on a steel shelf in a corner of a government facility that no longer exists on any map. The dust on the lid is thick, and the label has faded to a ghostly white in the dark. As we close the declassified file, we are left with the sound of a single Geiger counter in the room. It is clicking in a quiet and steady rhythm, in a space where no one is left to listen. It is the heartbeat of a world that was sacrificed for a secret that was never worth the price. The final truth is that the bone collectors are never truly finished with their work on the population. The data they gathered in the 1950s is still used today to calibrate the sensors of the modern age. We are all living in the shadow of their furnaces and their cold chemical dreams. Our bones are the ledger, and the government is still keeping the books in the darkness of the archive. Look at your hands in the mirror and remember the flash of the desert tests. The same energy that burned in 1955 is still pulsing in the marrow of your own growing skeleton. The file is closed, but the experiment is ongoing in every hospital and every nursery across the globe. You are a variable in a folder that will never be burned or forgotten by those in power. Welcome to the world where you are no longer a person, but a piece of radioactive evidence. The scent of the 1950s remains on the tongue of history, a mixture of formaldehyde and cold metal. The story of the bone collectors is your story, and the light you see in the dark is the legacy of Project Sunshine. The truth has been declassified, but the cage remains locked from the inside. Every heartbeat is a click on the dial of a machine you cannot see or stop. The architects of silence are still watching the graphs and waiting for the next harvest to begin. Your life is a data point in a plan that was written before you were born. The file is open forever.